I also received another response to the column from a person I think is probably black, calling himself Thousands. He writes, "It's too bad you don't know more about DNA and racial heritage markers in DNA. The fact that such markers exist does not mean that they are consistent or even always significant. For example, an African marker has been found in the DNA of a South Pacific Islander. Conclusion, possibly migration, but not necessarily. It could also be a spontaneous mutation of the DNA at that point, much the same as the one that created the same marker in African populations. The DNA in all races on Earth is remarkably similar. What science says is that there are no significant differences between the races when looking at DNA. That means that there is no significant difference between a white person and a black person, genetically speaking. That is what it means that race is a social construct. Is this clear now, you stupid cracker?" The silliness of this argument ought to be clear. First, Negro DNA did not spontaneously evolve or mutate in the South Pacific, and if the story is true at all, interracial breeding is a far more likely explanation. But secondly, it's true that the DNA in all races on Earth is remarkably similar, which is why all human races are classified as belonging to the same species. But the DNA of chimpanzees is 98.9% the same as that of humans. So the point is not really very meaningful, and it definitely doesn't mean that there is no significant difference between a white person and a black person, genetically speaking, or that race is a social construct. But what I found interesting about the response is that after invoking inaccurate science and weak reasoning to bolster his preachy opening about how it's too bad I don't know more about DNA, the writer simply loses it and winds up hurling names, betraying that it's not science at all that drives his rejection, but resentment of some kind. And that motivation is entirely clear in several other responses that I received from other readers who acknowledged being black. One from last October, for example, with the Slug response to hate article, namely my column, said, "You really don't know what you're talking about. Blacks, men, women, and children have been murdered and raped by white racists for hundreds of years, and little or nothing has been done about it statistically. Statistically, more blacks are incarcerated than whites. As a minority, does that mean fewer whites commit crimes, being the majority of the population in the United States?" And well, he goes on in this vein for a full page. And he winds up with this sentiment. "Whites call themselves Christians, but they don't forgive and wonder why every race in the world hates them. You should take a look through someone else's eyes before you form an opinion like that, because to tell you the white man's biggest problem is his arrogance, and that's why he will always be the hated. When Judgment Day arrives, God will judge the white man for his crimes against humanity, and who was first will be last." I hope that you have enjoyed this email as much as I've enjoyed writing it. I pray that God blesses you one day with the sight to truly see what's right in front of you and not to do your will but his. What I find interesting in this letter is its invocation of religion to justify what the writer acknowledges is hatred of the white man. He is licking his chops over the prospect of getting back at whites, even as he prays for me. Who is first will be last. He can't wait for the day. And this, again, is a common theme in the responses I've received from blacks. A somewhat similar but less gloating message said, "If America was to finally pay us for the free labor of our ancestors, all could be forgiven. But many whites feel as though it was okay for us to be enslaved for some barbaric reason. This is the same country that gave the Japanese 20,000 for being locked up in internment camps during World War II, and they was the enemy, for crying out loud. But we get enslaved for 236 some odd years, and not even an apology, much less reparations. And the people here call themselves Christians. What a cruel joke that is." As I said, my point is not to refute these arguments so much as to try to show what the arguments that whites rely on, what arguments whites rely on in resolving, in resisting racial consciousness. But even though these reactions came from blacks, I think they invoke these religious themes because they anticipate or have found by experience that a great many whites are affected by such appeals, and these appeals are often invoked by whites themselves. Almost literally, every time that I have debated publicly about race in a public forum, especially on talk radio or television programs, I get a response from whites, usually white conservatives, of quoting the Bible verse of Galatians 3:28. I'm sure most of you have heard it if you don't know it. The verse is, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus," from Paul's letter to the Galatians 3:28. This verse apparently has become the basic text for Christian universalism and Christian race denial, even though, number one, it says nothing about race per se. St. Paul never says there's neither black nor white, you will notice. But if it were interpreted as literally as the people who invoke it do, it would also deny the existence of sexual differences between men and women, which is a conclusion that I would think would appear to gut the Christian argument against gay marriage. But, and it would also, because it denies the existence of Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles, quite destroy any basis for the state of Israel. That's another issue. But the whole case for reparations and affirmative action depends on this presumption of white guilt that Christianity, as interpreted commonly today by both liberals and conservatives, tends to bolster. Personally, I'm very skeptical that many whites do actually feel guilt over racial issues. But it is true that whites seem to have a very difficult time dealing with the appeal to guilt. Understandably, they do not want to defend slavery, but they are also unable even to rely on a sort of historical argument that slavery, even though it may be bad and was evil, was really a widely accepted and widely practiced institution in the United States and throughout world history. Nor is it easy for most whites to argue that whites have done many things that in the past that would not be approved of today. Persecuting witches, for example, was wrong, but no one argues today that whites or Europeans owe reparations to women because they burned witches for a couple of hundred years in Europe. The Inquisition, religious intolerance, religious persecution, Protestants do not generally claim that the Catholic Church owes them reparations or has any debt of guilt because of religious persecution, nor do Catholics argue that about Protestants, to my knowledge. But these kinds of problems have, they don't seem to cause any problem. These kinds of questions don't cause any problems for most whites. It's only race that causes a problem, because that seems to be the drum that is always beaten. Slavery and racial exploitation are exceptions that most whites simply are unable to deal with objectively or adequately. Last November, I wrote a column in response to an op-ed by the black nationalist Shelby Steele that appeared in the Wall Street Journal on November 13th. Steele acknowledged that white racial consciousness was not permitted in Western society today, in contrast to the racial consciousness of non-whites that is permitted and even encouraged. And the reason for that double standard, he wrote, was that no group in recent history has more aggressively seized power in the name of its racial superiority than Western whites. This race illustrated for all time, through colonialism, slavery, white racism, Nazism, the extraordinary human evil that follows when great power is joined to an atavistic sense of superiority and destiny. This is why today's whites, the world over, cannot openly have a racial identity. Now, in my column, I did point out that this claim was simply untrue, that non-whites up until fairly recently in world history have probably committed far more violence and aggression against whites than whites had against them, given the Arab and Mongol invasions of the Middle Ages and indeed the Muslim conquest of white-controlled areas in Asia and Africa. But refuting Steele's case in that respect was not really my major point, which was to argue that whites themselves deny themselves racial consciousness for some of the reasons I'm trying to explore today. And frankly, I'm largely indifferent to Steele's argument about who has committed more violence against whom. I think it's fairly clear that you can kill a lot more people with a machine gun than you can with spears. So it may be true that whites, for all I know, have actually killed numerically more non-whites than they have killed of us. I just am unimpressed with that. But that point was exactly what most of those who responded to my column wanted to talk about. That is to dwell on white evil and to on white guilt. This is an important point to them. Thus, in a response to my column, a reader whose race I'm unable to tell for certain wrote, "Objectively speaking, Steele is right. How do you explain the fact that whites are approximately 20% of the world's population, yet occupy about 65% of its land surface? The Americas fell to the whites because they slaughtered at least 80 million people to occupy the vast spaces here. Canada to Tierra del Fuego. Then they slaughtered the indigenous Australians, Tasmanians, and New Zealanders to occupy those territories. They invaded Africa and slaughtered Africans in order to occupy those parts where they found the climate tolerable." And he goes on in that vein for 2 pages, actually. As I said, I'm more or less indifferent to this claim, but the apparent importance that he attaches to this, as well as the importance that Steele himself attached to it, suggests that they see it as critical in the case against whites and the legitimacy of white consciousness, and that in turn suggests that perhaps whites themselves are just as vulnerable to that argument as they are to the appeal to guilt over slavery. But as I remarked, I'm not at all convinced that real feelings of guilt are especially powerful among most whites. But what is apparently very powerful among them is not so much real guilt feelings as simply an inability to answer these kinds of accusations against whites, or to resist the argument that because these accusations are true, whites should not be allowed a distinct white racial consciousness or identity. That attitude is one that AR readers and racially conscious whites should consider addressing a lot more than I think we have.